obedience to authority. So we've seen that there is a crisis in the church, which is being supported and continued by the Pope, the bishops, pastors. This will only get worse in the coming months and years. We will be the ones who will be accused of being the heretics, of being too rigid, too traditional, too backward thinking. We've already been accused of that. It will continue. It will get worse. Conciliar Rome holds up the living tradition. I put that in quotes, living tradition, because there's no such thing. The adjective living is intended to suggest that tradition can move like every living thing. It can change. But this is precisely the modernist error of historicism. Doctrinal truth can never be reached definitively. This is what they mean by historicism. The doctrinal truth can never be reached definitively, but is perceived and expressed differently over the course of several centuries. That doctrine changes, that we perceive the truth in the end, it will constantly change. This error was condemned by Popes Pius X and Pius XII. Archbishop Lefebvre often reported that when he was speaking with Cardinal Ratzinger or other Roman personalities, and he would quote some condemnation issued by Pius IX, or some dogmatic definition by the Council of Trent, he would hear the questioner reply, "But Monsignor, we're no longer living in the time of Pius IX. We are not in the era of the Council of Trent." Tradition with a capital T ought to be distinguished from traditions with small t. Traditions with a capital T are immutable, unchangeable, while traditions of the latter sort can undergo certain changes. When we speak of tradition with a capital T, we mean apostolic tradition, the deposit of the faith confided once and for all to the apostles, and which the magisterium, the Catholic teaching authority, has to transmit and protect until the end of the world. But she has to protect it and transmit it the way she received it from the apostles, who received it from Christ. Can anything Christ gives us be improved upon? Well, the Vatican Council thinks so. This deposit was revealed by God, and this period of revelation was closed at the death of the Apostle John. Nothing new can be added to it or subtracted from it, nor can it be changed in any way. This revelation may develop or unfold. This development is homogeneous, that is, without mutation. There's no change involved. It's simply the unfolding of what was included from the beginning, which a kind of compression prevented from being fully visible. Just as a flower opens its petals and reveals its center, but the flower does not actually change and become something else. Tradition is living only in the sense that it is passed on by living persons who have the authority to defend it, to show its significance, to make it lived by faith, which is the function of the magisterium. But it remains immutable. Faith, truth, doesn't change. What's true remains true. And nothing that has once been defined by the magisterium can be modified. Traditions with a small t are those pious practices the rules of persons and institutes, liturgical or legal laws, customs that have been transmitted without being instituted by Christ at the time of the apostles. No, we use an Advent wreath now. Was that used at the time of the apostles? Yeah, but that has nothing to do with what we believe. It's a nice custom to count the weeks of Advent. When these modernists speak of living tradition, which should evolve, they mean that the role of the magisterium is not to safeguard the deposit of revelation, but to ensure ecclesiastical communion in space and time. Fidelity to tradition does not mean for them fidelity to the deposit handed down from the apostles, but rather docility to what the Pope, guarantor of unity, says today. In other words, they don't want you to hold on to what we've been received from Christ and the apostles, but you need to obey and follow what the Pope and the bishops are telling you today. Today. In this period, in this time. Forget what went before. So, do we have the right then to disobey if they command us in obedience? It's true that the matter of submission to the Pope, complete, filial, and trusting obedience is the normal rule. Yes, you should generally obey the Pope, your bishop, your pastor, in what they tell you. But the reality of the role does not mean that it never has exceptions. And if you look at church history, you will see that there have been exceptions. The Pope and the bishops have received their authority from Christ for the protection and the defense of the faith. The general rule is then, of course, to obey them. But should they happen to use their authority against the very purpose for which it was given to them, that is to say, by wishing to impose acts sinful or against the faith, then their subordinates not only have the right, but even the duty to resist them. We ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5:29. We are not talking here about simple personal injustice or a measure that one deems imprudent, but an order that goes directly against divine law when faith or morals are at stake. In this case, obedience would not be a virtue. It would be a vice. It would be, in reality, disobedience, while the apparent disobedience would prove to be true obedience, obeying God rather than men. If the man, the Pope, the bishop, the priest, tells you something which is against your faith, which is against the word, in other words, the word of God, who do you obey, the man or God? If you obey God, you are then in disobedience to the man. If you obey the man, you are in disobedience to God. When a pope abuses his mandate and causes the church serious harm, one has not only the right, but even the duty to resist him. We see this in the very beginning of the church when St. Paul stood up against St. Peter, who out of fear of displeasing the Judeo-Christians no longer wished to dine with them. This was a serious decision because it risked causing a split in the church, which might favor a false opinion that the practice of the Jewish law was incumbent upon all Christians. It gave scandal besides. St. Paul declared, "But when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I stood against him to his face, because he was deserving of blame." Galatians 2, verse 11. St. Thomas comments on St. Paul's resistance. It must be observed, however, that if the faith were endangered, a subject ought to rebuke his prelate, even publicly. Hence Paul, who was Peter's subject, rebuked him in public, on account of the imminent danger of scandal concerning the faith. Peter gave an example to superiors, that if at any time they should happen to stray from the straight path, they should not disdain to be reproved by their subjects. Peter was a humble man. He took Paul's rebuke, and he acted upon it. John de Torquemada quotes Innocent III. "One ought to obey the Pope in all things, provided that he does not rise up against the general discipline of the Church, in which case one should not follow him." Thomas Cajetan, in his defense of the papacy, says, "It's necessary to stand up to the Pope who would rend the Church. Otherwise, why should it be said that authority was given to build up and not to destroy?" That's the second epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 10. Against a bad usage of authority, one will employ the appropriate means, by refusing obedience in what is evil, by not seeking to please, by not keeping silent, by rebuking, by inviting the authorities to make the necessary reproaches, following the example of St. Paul, and in accordance with his precepts. Francis Suarez taught, should the Pope prescribe something against good morals, he should not be obeyed. Should he undertake something that is obviously against justice or the common good, it is licit to resist him. He further stated that the Pope would become schismatic were he to wish to excommunicate the whole Church, or were he to seek to change all the liturgical ceremonies that rest on apostolic tradition. Robert Bellarmine also teaches that it's licit to resist the Pope, who would harm the Church. Just as it is licit to resist a Pope who attacks the body, so it is licit to resist him if he attacks souls or disturbs the civil order, or above all, if he tries to destroy the Church. I say it is licit to resist him by not doing what he orders and by impeding the execution of his will. Does going against the Pope make us schismatics? Just as membership in the Church, at least by desire, is necessary for salvation, so is submission to the Pope. The submission which is precisely one of the conditions for belonging to the Church. But this submission obviously does not imply an unlimited obedience. Cajetan explains in his commentary on the Summa Theologica, quote, if someone, for a reasonable motive, holds the person of the Pope in suspicion and refuses his presence and even his jurisdiction, he does not commit the derelict of schism, nor any other whatsoever, provided that, and this is the important point, provided that he be ready to accept the Pope were he to not held in suspicion. It goes without saying that one has the right to avoid what is harmful and to ward off dangers. In fact, it may happen that the Pope could govern tyrannically, and that is all the easier as he has all the power. and does not fear any punishment from anyone on earth. End of quote. The virtue of obedience is a summit between two opposite vices, insubmission and servility. In the current crisis, true obedience consists neither in accepting the prevailing evils under the pretext that they are favored by the Pope, which would be servility, nor in refusing the authority of the Pope under the pretext that they're all bad, and the attitude of those who are sede vacantes. The true obedience consists in accepting the authority of the Pope as Pope, in praying for him and respecting his person while actively resisting the bad orientations he wishes to impose upon the Church. Again, true obedience consists in accepting the authority of the Pope as Pope. Yes, so fine, he's Pope. Pray for him. Your sede vacantes will not pray for him. They will not pray for the papal intentions, which are not really his intentions, but the intentions of the Church, which have been passed down for generations. So pray for him. Respect the office and the person, while you actively resist the bad orientations that he wishes to impart upon the Church. So is the Society of St. Pius X schismatic? The Society of St. Pius X is not schismatic. Schism is the rejection in principle of the Pope's authority, and not a simple act of disobedience. The Society of St. Pius X acknowledges the authority of the Pope, and they pray for him in every Mass. Even in times of confusion, when you're not sure exactly who's sitting on the throne, you can still pray for the Pope, and God will make sure the right one gets it. A man might say to his father, "You are not doing right," without telling him, "You are no longer my father." Notice those two different situations. A man may say to his father, "You're not doing right," just as you could say to the Pope, who is your father, the Holy Father, "You're not doing right," without saying, "You're not my father." To say "you're not my father" is to be schismatic. It suffices to answer with St. Paul, "But though we or an angel from heaven preach a gospel to you besides that which has been preached to you, let him be anathema." The same would apply. If we or an angel from heaven or the Pope or the bishop or your priest should preach a gospel to you other than what has been handed down to you, what has been preached to you, as Paul says, that we have given you, which came from Christ, let him be anathema. So, we shall see dioceses continue to constrain traditional movements, such as the Mass, in their diocese. Now as then, after the Council, for those who desire to defend the Catholic faith to the bitter end, it's impossible to place themselves in the hands of authorities who contradict or relativize the Catholic faith. That's why the doctrinal discussions called for by the Society of St. Pius X must precede any practical solutions. Unfortunately, the Society has reversed that stand and is now pushing for practical solutions over doctrinal resolutions. This was the cause of the rift a few years ago and the rise of the, quote, resistance. It will remain to be seen who will be standing when all of this has been accomplished. We do have our Lord's promise that the gates of hell shall not prevail.